The fluorescent lights of County General's emergency room buzzed with their usual sterile intensity as Dr. Sarah Mitchell stripped off her latex gloves and tossed them into the biohazard bin. 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and she had been on her feet for 14 hours straight. 3 car accidents, 2 cardiac events, 1 kitchen fire victim, and a steady stream of the usual chaos that filled the overnight shift. Her shoulders ached, her eyes burned, and all she wanted was to sign off her charts and escape into the cool October air. She rubbed her temples, feeling the familiar tension headache building behind her eyes, and reached for her coffee that had long since gone cold. The ER had finally quieted to a manageable hum, just a few patients in the waiting room with minor complaints that the night shift could handle. Sarah was pulling her dark hair from its ponytail when the automatic doors exploded inward with a crash that made everyone jump. A massive figure filled the doorway, backlit by the parking lot lights, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The man was enormous, easily 6 feet 4 inches tall, and built like he could break a person in half without effort. He wore a leather vest covered in patches and insignia she could not quite make out, dark jeans torn at the knees, and heavy boots that tracked blood across the linoleum floor. Road rash covered his right arm in angry red streaks, gravel still embedded in the torn skin, and blood ran down the side of his face from a gash above his eyebrow. His beard was matted with more blood, his knuckles were scraped raw, and he swayed slightly as he stood there, one hand pressed against the doorframe for support. Behind him, through the open doors, Sarah could see a line of motorcycles in the parking lot, their chrome gleaming under the streetlights, and hear the rumble of their engines. The sound hit her like a physical blow. Her younger brother Danny's face flashed through her mind, his bright smile in his senior photo, the way he had looked in his casket after the accident 5 years ago. A drunk biker had run a red light, traveling at nearly 80 miles per hour through a residential intersection, and Danny had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. 22 years old with his whole life ahead of him, gone in an instant because someone on a motorcycle thought they owned the road. Sarah's hands began to shake, and she gripped the edge of the nurse's station to steady herself. The room tilted slightly, and she could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. The biker took a step forward, and Sarah felt every muscle in her body tense, her professional training warring with the visceral fear and anger that threatened to overwhelm her. Sarah turned sharply to the nearest nurse, a young woman named Kelly, who had only been on staff for 6 months. Her voice came out harder than she intended, sharp enough that Kelly actually stepped back. "Call Dr. Patterson," Sarah said, already moving away from the nurse's station. "I am signing off. My shift ended 15 minutes ago." Kelly's eyes widened in confusion, her gaze darting between Sarah and the bleeding man, who had now taken another unsteady step into the emergency room, leaving a trail of crimson droplets across the white floor. "Dr. Mitchell," Kelly stammered. "Dr. Patterson is in surgery, the motorcycle accident from earlier. He will be in the OR for at least another 2 hours. "Then get Henderson," Sarah snapped, not looking back, her feet carrying her toward the staff exit as if they had a mind of their own. "Henderson left an hour ago. Family emergency," Kelly called after her, desperation creeping into her voice. "Dr. Mitchell, his blood pressure is dropping. He needs immediate attention." The world seemed to narrow to a tunnel, and all Sarah could see was that exit door, that escape from the leather and the motorcycles, and the memories that threatened to drown her. She could not do this. She could not stand there and stitch up someone who had probably been racing down some highway, reckless and careless, risking everyone else's lives for the thrill of the ride. Behind her, she heard Jake's deep voice, rougher now, weakening. "Please," he said. And there was no demand in it, just a simple request that somehow made everything worse. "I need help." Sarah's hands were shaking so badly she had to clench them into fists, her nails digging into her palms hard enough to leave marks. Danny's face swam before her eyes again, his casket being lowered into the ground while their mother sobbed, the way their father had aged 10 years in a single week. She was 5 feet from the exit when a hand caught her arm, firm but not rough. Rita Washington, the head nurse and a 30-year veteran of County General, stood there with an expression that Sarah had never seen before. Rita was a grandmother of 5, had worked every imaginable shift, had seen every tragedy the ER could offer, and her dark eyes were filled with something between disappointment and understanding. "Dr. Mitchell?" Rita said quietly, her voice low enough that only Sarah could hear, but carrying the weight of decades of experience. "You took an oath." Sarah tried to pull away, tears burning at the corners of her eyes. "You do not understand," she whispered. Rita's grip tightened just slightly. "I understand perfectly," Rita said, and there was steel beneath the gentleness. "But that man bleeding on my floor took an oath too, and right now yours is the only one that matters." Jake's knees buckled before anyone could reach him, and his massive frame hit the floor with a sickening thud that echoed through the emergency room. The impact seemed to shake the building itself, and suddenly the controlled chaos of the ER exploded into motion around him. Rita released Sarah's arm and was moving instantly, her years of training taking over as she dropped to her knees beside the fallen man, her fingers immediately going to his neck to check his pulse. "Code Blue!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the sudden commotion, and Kelly was already running for the crash cart, while another nurse grabbed the blood pressure cuff. "Get me 2 units of O negative and prep trauma room 2. Rita barked out orders with the precision of a general commanding troops. As Jake fell, his leather jacket had fallen open, and Sarah watched as if in slow motion as a worn brown wallet tumbled from the inner pocket, hitting the floor and sliding across the polished linoleum until it came to rest against her shoe. She stood frozen, her body still turned toward the exit, her mind screaming at her to leave, to let someone else handle this, to not get involved with this man who represented everything she had spent 5 years trying to forget. But her eyes were locked on that wallet, on the cracked leather and the faded edges, and almost without conscious thought, she bent down and picked it up. For the records, she told herself, opening it with shaking fingers to find his identification, to get his name and insurance information, to do the bare minimum that protocol required. The wallet fell open in her hands, and photographs spilled out like a waterfall of memories, fluttering to the floor around her feet. Sarah knelt down, gathering them automatically, and then her hands stopped moving entirely. The photograph she held showed Jake in Marine Corps dress blues, the uniform crisp and decorated with ribbons and medals she could not name but recognized as significant. He was younger in the photo, his beard neatly trimmed, his eyes bright and clear, and he was holding a little girl who could not have been more than 4 years old. The child's head was completely bald, smooth and pale in the sunlight of wherever the photo had been taken, and she wore a bright pink dress that seemed too large for her tiny frame. A medical port was visible just below her collarbone, the kind used for chemotherapy treatments, and she was smiling up at Jake with absolute trust and joy while he looked down at her with an expression of such fierce protective love that Sarah felt something crack inside her chest. The photograph slipped from Sarah's fingers, and she was moving before she even realized she had made a decision, her training slamming into place like a steel door closing over her fear and her grief. "Move him to Trauma 2, she ordered, her voice suddenly clear and commanding as she shoved the wallet into her pocket and snapped on fresh gloves that Rita thrust into her hands. "Get me a full trauma panel, CBC, tox screen, and I want a CT of his head immediately." She dropped to her knees beside Jake, her hands already assessing the damage with practiced efficiency, probing the gash above his eyebrow while her other hand checked his pupils with a penlight. "Pupils equal and reactive," she announced, "but we have significant blood loss and possible concussion." 2 nurses and an orderly lifted Jake onto a gurney, and Sarah was beside him in an instant, one hand pressed against the worst of his wounds as they rushed him down the corridor. His eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused and glassy, and his lips moved as he tried to speak. "Lily," he mumbled, the words slurred and desperate. "Promise. Have to keep my promise." Sarah leaned closer, still applying pressure to his head wound. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" she asked, following protocol even though she had seen his identification, needing to assess his cognitive function. "Jake Donovan," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Gotta get to Children's Hospital. Lily needs." His words trailed off as consciousness slipped away from him again. In Trauma Room 2, Sarah worked with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times, cleaning the road rash with methodical precision while calling out orders for medications and imaging. His license had fallen out of the wallet with the photos, and she had glimpsed the address before shoving everything into her pocket. Riverside, 340 miles north of County General. The clothes he wore were soaked through with sweat beneath the blood, and when they cut away his jacket and shirt, his skin was clammy and pale. "He has been riding for hours," Kelly said quietly, examining his legs, which showed the strain of gripping a motorcycle for an extended period. "In this condition," Sarah added, her mind racing as she sutured the gash above his eye with steady hands, wondering what could possibly drive a man to ride for 6 hours with wounds like these. What promise to a child named Lily could be worth dying for? The CT scan came back clear of any brain bleed, and as Sarah administered fluids and pain medication, Jake's eyes opened fully for the first time, focusing on her with sudden clarity that seemed almost painful in its intensity. "My daughter," he said, his voice hoarse but stronger now, his hand reaching out to grab Sarah's wrist with surprising strength. "Lily Donovan, she is here, 3rd floor, oncology ward." Sarah's hand stilled on the bandage she was wrapping around his forearm. Her mind connecting pieces she had not realized were scattered before her. "The little girl from the photo," she said, and it was not a question. Jake nodded, tears cutting tracks through the dirt and dried blood on his face. 9 years old, he said, each word clearly costing him effort. "Rare form of leukemia, been fighting it for 2 years. She needs a bone marrow transplant, and I am the only match they found." He coughed, wincing at the pain, but continued with desperate urgency. "I have been working an oil rig in Alaska for the past 6 months, double shifts, trying to pay for her treatments. Got the call 8 hours ago that she crashed. Her body is rejecting everything. And if she does not get the transplant in the next 48 hours... His voice broke completely, and he had to take several shaking breaths before he could continue. "I caught the first flight out, landed at the airport 2 hours ago, but there was a wreck on the interstate. Complete standstill, nothing moving. So I rented a motorcycle because I could lane split, get through the traffic, and I rode straight here. Hit a deer about 10 miles out, went down hard, but I got back up because Lily is waiting for me, and I promised her I would always come when she needed me." Jake's eyes locked onto Sarah's, and she saw in them the same desperate love she had seen in the photograph, magnified by fear and exhaustion and sheer determination. "Please," he whispered, his voice breaking, "please let me see my little girl before they put me under for the surgery. I need her to know I kept my promise, that I came for her." Sarah's fingers flew across the computer keyboard at the nurse's station, pulling up the hospital records with her access credentials. And there it was, Lily Marie Donovan, age 9, admitted to pediatric oncology 6 days ago with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Condition critical, awaiting bone marrow transplant from matched donor. The words on the screen blurred slightly as Sarah read them, her professional detachment cracking further with each line of medical terminology that spelled out a little girl's fight for survival. She printed the records and took the elevator to the 3rd floor, her heart pounding as she approached the oncology ward where a woman sat alone in the waiting room, her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Excuse me," Sarah said softly. "Are you Grace Donovan?" The woman's head snapped up, and Sarah saw a face ravaged by exhaustion and fear, eyes red and swollen from crying, dark circles underneath that spoke of nights without sleep. Grace was perhaps 35 years old, but looked a decade older in this moment, wearing yoga pants and a wrinkled sweatshirt that suggested she had been living in this hospital for days. "Yes," Grace said, her voice sharp with desperation. "Is Jake here? Did he finally make it? They told me he landed 2 hours ago, and I have been calling his phone over and over, and Lily keeps asking for her daddy, and I do not understand what is taking him so long." Sarah sat down beside her, choosing her words carefully. "He is here. He is in the emergency room. He was in a motorcycle accident on his way from the airport." Grace's hand flew to her mouth, a strangled sound escaping her throat. Is he okay? Can he still do the transplant? Because if he cannot, then Lily will—" She could not finish the sentence, could not speak the words that would make the nightmare real. "He is stable," Sarah assured her quickly. "He will be able to donate, but I need to know about Lily's condition." Grace pulled out her phone with shaking hands and showed Sarah a photo from earlier that day. A small girl with no hair, pale as paper, tubes and wires connecting her to machines. But her eyes were open and she was trying to smile at the camera. Sarah stared at that image and then pulled Jake's wallet from her pocket, found the photograph of him in his dress blues holding the tiny bald child. "This photo," Sarah said quietly. "When was this taken?" Grace took the wallet, her eyes filling with fresh tears. 5 years ago," she whispered. "Lily's first round of chemo, right after Jake and I separated. He has carried that every single day since then, through everything, through the divorce and the custody battles and him having to move away for work. He never stopped being her father, never stopped loving her, even when I made it so hard for him." Sarah looked at the photo again, at the little girl who reminded her so much of Danny with his bright smile and his whole life ahead of him, and she made her decision. Sarah returned to the emergency room to find Dr. Patterson out of surgery and reviewing Jake's charts, his gray eyebrows drawn together in concern as he studied the imaging results and vital signs. "Mitchell," he said without looking up, "your shift ended 3 hours ago. What are you still doing here?" She moved to stand beside him, looking at the monitors that showed Jake's erratic blood pressure readings, the numbers fluctuating in ways that made her stomach clench with worry. "His concussion is worse than the initial assessment suggested," Patterson continued, pointing to subtle indicators on the CT scan that Sarah had missed in her urgency to stabilize him. "He needs 24-hour observation minimum before we can clear him for surgery. Protocol is clear on this." Sarah felt her chest tighten, thinking of the little girl 3 floors above them, whose life was measured in hours now. "The oncology team needs him in 18 hours maximum," she said quietly. "Lily Donovan cannot wait 24 hours. Her body is shutting down." Patterson sighed heavily, closing the chart and finally looking at Sarah with tired eyes that had seen too many impossible situations. "Then we have a serious problem," he said, "because his blood pressure is all over the place, his heart rate is inconsistent, and no anesthesiologist in this hospital will clear him for a bone marrow extraction in this condition. If we put him under and something goes wrong, we lose the donor, and the child loses her only chance." Sarah stared at Jake's unconscious form on the gurney, his massive frame looking somehow vulnerable under the harsh fluorescent lights, his hand twitching slightly as if reaching for someone even in sleep. "I will oversee his care personally," she heard herself say, the words coming out before she had fully formed the thought. "I will monitor him through the night, manage his medications, stabilize his blood pressure, and have him ready for surgery by morning." Patterson's eyes widened in surprise. "Mitchell, you have been on shift for 14 hours already. You need rest. And frankly, I am confused about why you are suddenly so invested in this particular patient." Sarah opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again, because she did not have words for what had shifted inside her when she saw that photograph, when she heard about a father who rode through pain and exhaustion for his daughter's chance at life. Rita appeared beside them, crossing her arms and fixing Sarah with a knowing look. "Because sometimes," Rita said softly when Sarah remained silent, "we have to save the people we could not save before, even if they are not the same people at all." The clock on the wall read 2:30 in the morning when Sarah pulled a chair beside Jake's bed in the private observation room, her clipboard resting on her lap as she monitored his vitals for the 100th time that night. His blood pressure had stabilized somewhat, but he remained restless, his large frame shifting uncomfortably on the hospital bed that seemed too small to contain him, his face contorting with pain even through the medication. His leather vest hung on a hook by the door, and Sarah found her eyes drawn to it despite herself, noticing details she had been too consumed with trauma to see before. There was a patch that read USMC in bold letters, another that showed a motorcycle with angel wings and the words "Ride for the Fallen," and several more she could not quite make out in the dim lighting. Jake's eyes opened slowly, focusing on her with clarity that suggested the pain medication was wearing off. "You are still here," he said, his voice rough but surprised. Sarah nodded, making a notation on his chart. "Your blood pressure needs constant monitoring," she said, keeping her tone professional. Jake watched her for a long moment, then spoke quietly. "I served 12 years, he said, and Sarah's pen stilled on the paper. 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan, Marine Corps infantry. Came home with my body in one piece, but my mind shattered into 1,000 pieces I could not fit back together. The nightmares, the anger, the way I could not sit in a restaurant without mapping every exit and watching every door. Grace tried, God knows she tried, but I was drowning and I was pulling her and Lily down with me." Sarah set down her clipboard, something in his voice pulling her full attention. "The divorce was my fault," Jake continued, staring at the ceiling. "I pushed them away because I thought they would be safer without me, without the broken thing I had become. But then I found the Iron Brotherhood, the motorcycle club. They are all veterans, all of us trying to find our way back from the darkness. They gave me purpose again, taught me I could still be useful, still help people." Sarah thought of the patches on his vest, of the charity rides and the fallen soldiers honored on his leather, and felt the last of her assumptions crumbling like sand castles before a tide. "They saved my life," Jake whispered, tears sliding down his temples. "And now I need to save my daughters." Sarah sat in silence for a long moment, watching the monitors beep their steady rhythm, and then she found herself speaking words she had not said aloud in years. "My brother Danny was 22 years old when he died," she said quietly, her hands gripping the edge of her clipboard until her knuckles turned white. "He was 3 weeks away from graduating college, had a job lined up at an engineering firm, had his whole life planned out in that way young people do when they think they are invincible." Jake turned his head to look at her, his expression shifting to something softer, more attentive. "A biker ran a red light at 80 miles per hour through a residential intersection," Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the tears that burned behind her eyes. "He was drunk, had been at a bar for hours, got on his motorcycle anyway because he thought he was fine to ride. Danny was crossing the street to his apartment, had looked both ways, had the walk signal, did everything right. The impact killed him instantly." Jake closed his eyes, his jaw tightening with pain that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. "I was in medical school when it happened," Sarah said, staring at her hands. "I switched my focus to emergency medicine because I thought if I could save other people, if I could stand in that ER and fight death every single night, then maybe Danny's death would mean something. But I could not save my bias, could not let go of my hatred for everyone who looked like the man who killed him. Every leather vest, every motorcycle engine, every person who chose to ride became the enemy in my mind, and I knew it was wrong, but I could not stop feeling it." She looked up at Jake, meeting his eyes directly. "When you came through those doors tonight, I saw the man who killed my brother, not a father trying to save his daughter, and I am ashamed of that." Jake was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I am sorry," he said simply, and there was no defensiveness in it, no attempt to explain or justify or distance himself from her pain. Nobody should lose their brother like that. Nobody should have to carry that kind of grief. "Your anger is justified, Dr. Mitchell, and you do not owe me or anyone else forgiveness for it. But I am grateful more than I can ever express that you chose to see past it tonight." The rumble of 15 motorcycle engines at 5 in the morning shattered the quiet of the hospital parking lot, and Sarah looked up from Jake's chart to see the security guard's radio crackling to life with urgent chatter. She moved to the window and watched as a formation of bikes pulled into the visitor spaces with military precision, their headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like searchlights. The riders dismounted in unison, all wearing leather vests identical to Jake's, and Sarah felt her pulse quicken before she consciously reminded herself that these were not the enemies she had spent 5 years imagining. The lead rider was a tall man with silver hair pulled back in a ponytail, his vest marked with patches that identified him as President of the Iron Brotherhood, and he strode toward the emergency room entrance with the confidence of someone who had walked into far more dangerous places than a hospital. Sarah met them in the lobby where two security guards had positioned themselves nervously, hands hovering near their radios as they eyed the group of leather-clad men and women who had just filled the waiting area. "We are here for Jake Donovan," the silver-haired man announced, his voice carrying authority despite the early hour. "My name is Marcus Sullivan, and these are his brothers and sisters." One of the security guards stepped forward, his young face uncertain. "Visiting hours do not start until 8, and we have policies about group visits." Marcus did not move, did not raise his voice, simply stood there with the patience of someone who had faced down far more intimidating opposition. "Jake is our family," he said calmly, "and family does not wait for visiting hours." Sarah stepped forward before the situation could escalate, her hospital identification clearly visible as she positioned herself between the security guards and the bikers. "These people are with me," she said firmly, looking at the guards with the authority of someone who had earned her place in this hospital. "Mr. Donovan is my patient, and I am clearing them for access." Marcus turned to look at her, his weathered face showing surprise, and then something like respect. "Dr. Mitchell," he said, and she realized Grace must have called them, must have told them everything. "We brought Jake's complete medical records from his VA file, including his blood type and any medications. We also have 5 members of our club who share his blood type and are prepared to donate if needed for his surgery or for little Lily." Another member stepped forward, a woman with gray streaks in her dark hair, holding a cooler. "We have food for Grace too," she said quietly. "She has not been eating, has not left Lily's side for days." Sarah looked at the group assembled before her, seeing not the menacing gang she had imagined in her darkest moments, but a family bound by shared trauma and loyalty. People who rode through the night because one of their own needed them, and she felt the last wall around her heart finally begin to crumble. Sarah guided Grace down to the hospital cafeteria at 6 in the morning, insisting that the exhausted woman needed food even if she could not imagine eating, and they sat at a table by the window as the sun began to paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Grace held a cup of coffee between her hands like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to the earth, and Sarah waited patiently until the other woman was ready to speak. "The divorce was necessary," Grace said finally, her voice flat with exhaustion. "Jake came home from his 3rd deployment, and he was not the man I married. He was someone I did not recognize. The nightmares every night, waking up screaming or throwing himself out of bed reaching for weapons that were not there. He could not be in crowds, could not relax, was always watching and waiting for threats that only he could see. I tried to understand, tried to be patient. But Lily was 3 years old and she was scared of her own father because he would snap at sudden noises or stare at nothing for hours." She stirred her coffee absently, staring into its dark surface. "But even after I asked him to leave, even after the divorce was finalized and he moved away, he never missed a single child support payment, not once in 6 years. He called Lily every Sunday, no matter where he was, from oil rigs in Alaska or construction sites in the middle of nowhere, even if it meant driving an hour to find cell service. He took the most dangerous jobs, the ones that paid triple because they were on remote sites or required months away from civilization, and every penny went toward her medical bills." Sarah thought of the worn wallet, of the photograph that Jake had carried for 5 years through all those dangerous places and difficult times. Grace looked up, meeting Sarah's eyes with a raw honesty that came from someone who had nothing left to hide. "I stopped loving my husband years ago, Dr. Mitchell," she said softly. "But he never stopped being her father, never stopped fighting for her. And that photo you showed me from his wallet proves it. He kept the picture from her very first cancer battle, from the worst day of our lives when we learned our baby might die, and he has carried her through every moment since then, even when he could not be with her." Morning light streamed through the hospital windows as Sarah checked Jake's blood pressure one final time, satisfied that he had stabilized enough for what needed to happen next. And she found herself saying words she never thought she would speak to a patient in his condition. "I'm taking you to see your daughter," she said, and Jake's eyes filled with tears so quickly it took her breath away. She helped him into a wheelchair despite his protests that he could walk, kept his IV line attached, and pushed him toward the elevator with Marcus and 2 other club members following at a respectful distance. The oncology floor was quieter than the emergency room, painted in soft colors meant to soothe sick children, and Grace met them at the door to Lily's room with a face that showed hope and terror in equal measure. "She is awake," Grace whispered. "She has been asking for you all night." Sarah pushed the wheelchair through the doorway, and there in the bed surrounded by machines and monitors was the little girl from the photograph, except now she was 6 years older and fighting a battle that showed in every hollow of her pale face. But when Lily saw Jake, her eyes went wide and bright, and she smiled with such pure joy that Sarah felt her own eyes burning with tears. "Daddy," Lily whispered, her voice weak but filled with wonder. "You came. You promised you would always come." Jake was out of the wheelchair before Sarah could stop him, moving to his daughter's bedside and taking her small hand in his massive scarred one with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man his size. "Nothing in this world could keep me away, baby girl," he said, his voice breaking on every word, and he pressed his forehead against hers in a gesture so tender that Grace had to turn away, covering her mouth to stifle a sob. Lily's hand reached up to touch the bandage on Jake's head, her fingers trembling. "I am scared, Daddy," she whispered. And the adult awareness in her young voice spoke of a child who understood exactly how close to the edge she stood. "I know it hurts, and I know the transplant might not work, and I am so scared." Jake pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his own face wet with tears he made no effort to hide. "Then I will be brave enough for both of us," he said firmly. And Sarah stood in the doorway watching this father and daughter, and remembering her own brother, remembering all the things she never got to say to Danny before he was gone, and she wept for both the living and the dead. Sarah returned to the emergency department with a determination that burned through her exhaustion, pulling Jake's chart and spreading his vital signs across the nurse's station like a battle plan that needed strategic analysis. His blood pressure had improved through the night, but not enough, the reading still fluctuating between acceptable and dangerously low. And the transplant team had made their position crystal clear. They needed him in surgery in 6 hours, or Lily's window would close forever. She paged Dr. Patterson, then called down to anesthesiology and asked for Dr. Kumar, their best and most experienced specialist. And within 20 minutes she had assembled a team in the conference room that looked at her like she had lost her mind. "You want to do what?" Patterson said, his voice rising slightly as he looked at the medication protocol Sarah had outlined on the whiteboard. Kumar leaned forward, studying her notes with a frown that carved deep lines into his face. "This cocktail of vasopressors and beta blockers is incredibly aggressive," he said carefully, "and if his system does not respond correctly, it could trigger cardiac arrest or stroke." Sarah stood her ground, pointing to the research she had pulled up on her tablet showing similar protocols used in emergency combat medicine. "We build his blood volume with rapid transfusion, stabilize his pressure with controlled medication, and monitor him continuously until surgery," she explained, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "It is risky, but doing nothing guarantees that little girl dies." Patterson looked at Kumar, then back at Sarah. "If this goes wrong, Mitchell," his voice was quiet but firm. "I know," Sarah interrupted, meeting his eyes without flinching, "but if we do not try, then we have already failed." They brought the plan to Jake 2 hours later, Sarah explaining every risk in clear medical terms, while Marcus and Grace stood on either side of his bed. "Do whatever it takes," Jake said before she even finished, his voice absolutely certain. And when Sarah explained they would need multiple units of blood to increase his reserves, 5 members of the Iron Brotherhood were already rolling up their sleeves in the donation center downstairs, their blood types matching Jake's, their loyalty expressed in the most literal way possible. The surgical team moved with practiced efficiency as they prepared Jake for the bone marrow extraction, starting the aggressive medication protocol Sarah had designed, while monitoring every heartbeat and breath with equipment that beeped and hummed around his bed. In the waiting room outside the surgical wing, The Iron Brotherhood had arranged themselves in a quiet vigil that looked nothing like the menacing presence Sarah had imagined just hours before. And as she walked past them toward the nurses' station, she found herself pausing to really look at each face. There was Marcus with his silver hair and weathered features, reading a worn paperback book of poetry. Beside him sat a younger man with kind eyes who wore a wedding ring and had photographs of 2 small children tucked into his vest pocket. A woman with laugh lines around her eyes was knitting something small and pink, her fingers moving with the muscle memory of someone who had created countless baby blankets. They were veterans and fathers and teachers and mechanics, people with mortgages and grocery lists and stories etched into the lines of their faces, and Sarah felt shame wash over her for the assumption she had carried like weapons. Marcus looked up as if sensing her gaze, and he stood slowly, approaching her with the careful respect of someone who understood boundaries. "Dr. Mitchell," he said quietly, "I want you to know what you have done for Jake and Lily means everything to all of us." Sarah shook her head, still processing her own transformation. "I almost refused to help him," she admitted, the words bitter on her tongue. Marcus nodded as if he already knew. "Our club motto is 'No brother left behind,'" he said, "and Jake lives that motto more than anyone I have ever known. He has talked 3 of our members down from suicide after they came home from war and could not find a reason to keep living. He drives to their houses at 2 in the morning when the nightmares get too bad, sits with them until dawn, reminds them they are not alone." Sarah thought of her brother Danny, of how he had died alone on a dark street with no one to help him, and she realized with painful clarity that Jake represented everything she wished Danny could have had: a tribe that protected its own, a support system that understood trauma, a purpose beyond survival. She had judged an entire community by the actions of one drunk driver, had painted them all with the same brush of hatred, and in doing so, she had nearly let a little girl lose her father and her only chance at life. The surgical suites were side by side on the 4th floor, and Sarah found herself scrubbing in beside the transplant team, even though orthopedic surgery was not her specialty, because she needed to see this through to the end, needed to witness the conclusion of the story that had shattered and rebuilt her in the span of one impossible night. Jake was wheeled into operating room 3 while 3 floors below the oncology team prepared Lily for the transplant that would either save her life or be her final battle. And the clock on the wall showed 9:15 in the morning when the first incision was made. The bone marrow extraction was supposed to take 2 hours, but complications arose almost immediately. Jake's concussion causing his blood pressure to spike dangerously as the anesthesia deepened, and Sarah watched Dr. Kumar work with steady hands to adjust medications and maintain the delicate balance between keeping Jake under and keeping him alive. 4 hours into the procedure, alarms began sounding as Jake's heart rate became erratic, and the surgical team moved with controlled urgency while Sarah heard herself calling out suggestions from her position at the monitoring station, her emergency medicine training finding purchase in this unfamiliar territory. In the waiting room, the Iron Brotherhood had not moved except to rotate who went to check on Grace, and Marcus stood at the window watching the sun climb higher in the sky while his lips moved in what might have been prayer or simply a conversation with brothers who had not made it home from war. Grace sat with her face in her hands, her body shaking with sobs she had held back for days, and Sarah left the observation window to sit beside her, putting an arm around this woman she barely knew but understood completely. They were 2 women who had lost different versions of the same man, one to war and trauma and the impossible distance that grief creates, the other to a senseless accident and 5 years of misdirected hatred. And now they sat together, united by hope for a little girl who carried both their hearts in her fragile, failing body. The bone marrow had been successfully extracted and transplanted into Lily by 3 in the afternoon, but the critical period was just beginning as both father and daughter lay in recovery rooms separated by 2 floors in a lifetime of love that refused to break despite every obstacle the universe had thrown in its path. Sarah moved between Jake's room in post-surgical recovery and Lily's suite in pediatric oncology, like a ghost haunting the corridors, checking monitors and adjusting medications with hands that had long since stopped shaking from exhaustion. Rita found her at the nurse's station at midnight, nearly 26 hours after her shift had officially ended, and placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder with a knowing expression that held no judgment. "Dr. Mitchell, you need to rest," Rita said softly, but there was no real expectation in her voice because she already knew the answer. "I have to see this through," Sarah replied, her eyes fixed on the computer screen showing vital signs from both patients, and Rita simply nodded and moved away to let her continue her vigil. Marcus appeared an hour later carrying 2 cups of coffee from the cafeteria, one of which he set down beside Sarah's keyboard without asking if she wanted it, and he stood there for a long moment before speaking. "You did not have to care," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion and gratitude. "You could have walked away, could have let your pain define your choices, but you chose to see past it, chose to save a man you had every reason to hate. That is what heroes do, Dr. Mitchell. They choose compassion even when it costs them everything." Sarah looked up at him with tears streaming down her face, no longer trying to hide the grief that had lived inside her chest like a stone for 5 years. "I have been running from my brother's death since the moment it happened," she whispered, "throwing myself into work and anger, because if I stopped moving, I would have to feel how much it hurt to lose him. This family's crisis, watching Jake ride through hell for his daughter, and Grace holding on to hope despite impossible odds, it is forcing me to confront everything I have been avoiding, and I do not know if I am strong enough." Jake's eyes opened at 6 in the morning on Wednesday, nearly 24 hours after he had crashed through the emergency room doors, and the first word out of his mouth was a name spoken with desperate urgency. "Lily," he rasped, his hand reaching for IV lines. He tried to pull away, his body attempting to rise from the bed, despite the surgery that had taken pieces of him to save his daughter. Sarah was at his side instantly, her hands firm on his shoulders as she pressed him back against the pillows with surprising strength for someone so much smaller. "The transplant was successful," she said clearly, making sure he heard every word through the fog of anesthesia and pain medication. "The bone marrow is in Lily's body, and now we wait for her system to respond, for the cells to engraft and begin fighting the cancer." Jake's face contorted with emotion, tears sliding from the corners of his eyes as he gripped Sarah's wrist with a strength that would have been alarming if she had not understood the desperation behind it. "I need to see her. I need to be there," he said, trying again to sit up despite the surgical wounds and the weakness that made his massive frame shake like a child's. Sarah pushed him back down again, gentler this time. "You did your part, Jake," she said, her voice steady and sure. "You saved her. You gave her the weapon she needs to fight this disease, and now you have to let her use what you gave her. Let her body do the work while you heal." Jake's composure shattered completely, his shoulders heaving with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere so deep inside him that they threatened to tear him apart. "I could not save my marriage," he choked out between gasps for air. "Could not beat the demons in my head. Could not be the husband Grace deserved or the father Lily needed when she was small. And I have spent 6 years trying to make up for all my failures. But if I can save her, if I can give her a chance to grow up and have a life, then maybe I will not have been completely worthless." Sarah sat on the edge of his bed and took his scarred hand in both of hers, holding on with a fierceness that surprised them both. "You already did," she said, and her voice broke with emotion she no longer tried to hide. "You rode 340 miles with a concussion and massive blood loss because your daughter needed you, and that makes you a hero, Jake Donovan, whether you believe it or not." 36 hours after the transplant, Lily's white blood cell count began to rise, and the oncology team gathered around her monitors with cautious optimism as numbers that had been falling for days started climbing toward normal ranges, slow but steady progress that spoke of bone marrow beginning to engraft and fight. Sarah was checking Jake's surgical wounds when the call came from pediatric oncology that Lily was awake and asking for her father, and she made a decision that would have scandalized hospital administration if they had known about it. She helped Jake into a wheelchair despite protocols that said he should remain in bed for another 12 hours, disconnected monitors that would have alarmed at the nurse's station, and wheeled him to the elevator with Rita covering for them by claiming she needed to run tests. Lily's face lit up when Jake came through the door, and Grace moved aside without hesitation as he positioned the wheelchair beside the bed and took his daughter's small hand in his. Her eyes went immediately to the bandages on his head and arm, widening with concern that seemed too adult for a 9-year-old face. "You got hurt coming to me," she said. And it was not quite a question, more an understanding that carried the weight of guilt no child should have to bear. Jake smiled through his own exhaustion, squeezing her fingers gently. "Nothing could stop me from keeping my promise," he said, and Lily's brow furrowed in confusion. "What promise?" she asked, her voice still weak, but clearer than it had been in days. "That I would always fight for you," Jake said, his voice breaking on the words. "Always, no matter where I am, or how far I have to travel, or what stands in my way. I will fight for you, Lily." Grace moved to stand on the other side of the bed, and for the first time in 6 years, the three of them were together in the same space, without anger or lawyers or the bitter residue of a marriage that could not survive war's aftermath. Sarah watched from the doorway as Grace reached across Lily to touch Jake's shoulder briefly, a gesture of gratitude and acknowledgement, and Jake nodded in return with understanding that passed between two people who had loved each other once and would never love each other that way again, but were bound forever by the girl between them. 1 week after the transplant, Lily's numbers continued to climb steadily toward normal, and the oncology team spoke in cautiously optimistic terms about remission and long-term survival, words that made Grace cry with relief every time she heard them. Jake had healed enough to be discharged, though his body still bore the marks of his desperate ride, and he sat in Lily's room telling her stories about Alaska and the oil rigs where he would return in 2 weeks to continue earning money for her ongoing treatments. The Iron Brotherhood organized a fundraiser ride that Sunday, and 200 motorcycles gathered in the hospital parking lot at dawn, their engines rumbling like controlled thunder as riders from 3 states arrived to support one of their own. Sarah found herself volunteering at the event, helping to register participants and distribute the commemorative patches that had been made with Lily's name and the words "Ride for Hope" emblazoned across them. And as the day progressed, she met families and veterans and people whose lives had been touched by the club's charity work. There was a widow whose mortgage had been paid by the Brotherhood after her husband died in Afghanistan, a teenager who received a college scholarship from their education fund, a veteran who credited Marcus with saving his life during a suicidal crisis. These were not the dangerous gang Sarah had imagined in her darkest moments, but a community of broken people who had found healing in helping others, who transformed their pain into purpose and rode together so no one would face their battles alone. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Sarah drove to Riverside Cemetery for the first time in 3 years, carrying a photograph she had found in her parents' attic of Danny standing beside his own motorcycle, the one he had owned and loved before the accident that had nothing to do with his riding, but everything to do with someone else's recklessness. She placed the photo against his headstone with shaking hands and spoke words she should have said years ago, separating the one drunk driver who had stolen her brother from the thousands of riders who lived and rode responsibly, who built communities and saved lives and deserved better than her blanket condemnation. "I am sorry I let my anger at one person poison my view of everyone," she whispered, her fingers tracing Danny's name carved in granite, and in the quiet of that moment, surrounded by the sounds of distant traffic and evening birds, Sarah finally found the peace that had eluded her for 5 long years. 3 months later, on a cold December evening 2 days before Christmas, Sarah sat at her desk in the emergency department completing paperwork from her shift when a card arrived in the inter-office mail with her name written in careful child's handwriting across the envelope. Inside was a photograph taken at Thanksgiving showing Lily seated between Jake and Grace at a dining room table laden with food, and the little girl's head was covered with short, dark hair that stood up in soft wisps like new grass after a long winter. Her smile was enormous and genuine, the kind of joy that only someone who has stared death in the face and walked away can truly understand, and both Jake and Grace had their arms around her with expressions that showed they knew exactly how precious this moment was. The note tucked inside the card was written in Jake's blocky handwriting and read simply, "Dr. Mitchell, you saw past my leather to my heart that night when you had every reason to turn away, and in doing so you saved 2 lives, Lily's and mine, because I would not have survived losing her. Some heroes wear scrubs instead of capes. Thank you for choosing to see us as human beings worthy of saving. Merry Christmas from Jake, Lily, and Grace." Sarah placed the photograph on her desk beside the framed picture of Danny that she had finally been able to display without pain overwhelming her. And she understood now that healing was not about forgetting the people you loved or pretending the trauma never happened, but about choosing to see the full humanity in every person who crossed your path, regardless of how they dressed or what they rode or what assumptions your fear tried to force upon them. 2 hours later, the automatic doors burst open and paramedics rushed in with a patient on a gurney, a young woman in leather chaps and a motorcycle helmet that had been cut away to reveal a head injury, and Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the old panic trying to resurface like a monster she thought she had defeated. But then she took a deep breath, steadied herself with both hands on the counter, and thought of Jake's desperate ride through pain to save his daughter, of Marcus and the Brotherhood's quiet vigil, of Lily's trust that her father would always come when she needed him. Sarah walked forward with purpose, her training and her hard-won compassion leading the way. And when she reached the gurney, she looked down at the injured rider with clear eyes that saw a human being in need rather than a symbol of her grief. "I am Dr. Mitchell," she said firmly, her voice steady and sure, "and let us get you taken care of."